On Thursday, the 22nd of September 2022, just before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a car pulled up on a quiet residential street in Birmingham's Harborne district. Within minutes, what had been planned as a controlled robbery turned violent. A single knife strike left a man fighting for his life behind the wheel. Years later, on Wednesday, the 31st of January 2024, another man welcomed someone into his flat in Errington just before midnight. Behind that closed door, something brutal took place. For nearly a week, no one came looking, and when the silence was finally broken, what police found inside told a far darker story. 2 different crimes, 2 different victims, both carried out in ordinary places, in broad daylight and behind closed doors, by men who thought they could outsmart the system. This is the story of Richard Hoppley and Wallace Webb, and how the police exposed the men responsible. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Richard Hoppley was 43 years old when he died. To those who knew him best, he was a kind son who had struggled for years with addiction. His dependency had pushed him into a dangerous world, one where debts and disputes were settled with violence rather than conversation. By 2022, he was working as a driver for a Birmingham drug dealer, a role that kept him on the edge of the trade, close enough to earn money, but never far from danger. It was a position occupied by thousands across the UK, men and women caught between legitimate poverty and the criminal economy that thrives in its shadow. Richard wasn't a dealer himself. He didn't control territory or make decisions. He simply drove, delivering product and collecting payment, a middleman whose survival depended on staying invisible and compliant. But invisibility offers no protection when conflicts erupt between rival factions, and compliance becomes irrelevant when you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. The roots of the conflict that led to his death began with something small, almost absurdly trivial in hindsight. A fake £20 note. Nicholas Stallard, a long-time drug user, had handed it over to the dealer known locally as Ace. That single act, whether intentional fraud or careless mistake, caused a rift between them and set in motion a chain of events that would spiral out of control. Stallard was angry, humiliated perhaps, and saw an opportunity for revenge. He and his associate, Paul Hales, aligned themselves with 2 others who had their own motives for targeting Ace. At the center was Ayub Khan, 29 years old, known in his area of Harborne not just as a user, but as someone with connections, ambition, and a willingness to organize violence when it served his interests. He wasn't a bystander or a minor player. In court, he would later be described as the architect of what was to come, the man who conceived the plan, selected the location, and coordinated the others. Alongside him was Muhammad Karim, just 24 years old at the time. Karim worked as Khan's drug runner, younger, vulnerable to influence, but armed and willing to act when instructed. Stallard and Hales became the enforcers. One in his 40s, the other in his 60s, they brought numbers and physical presence to the plan. Their role was simple: intimidate, back up the threats, and make sure the dealer they lured in couldn't resist or escape. Ayub Khan had chosen the ground carefully. Underwood Close, a quiet road in Harborne, seemed ordinary, the kind of street where neighbors knew each other by sight and children played in front gardens. But to Khan, it offered something more valuable than anonymity. It offered cover and escape. A narrow alleyway sat close by, an easy route out if the plan went wrong, a detail that suggested he had studied the area beforehand, walking the streets and noting exits. On Thursday, the 22nd of September 2022, just before 3 in the afternoon, the group put their scheme into motion. The gang believed they could lure Ace to the address and strip him of drugs and cash without consequences. The bait was simple: a meeting arranged for business, the kind of transaction that happened dozens of times each day across Birmingham's informal economy. But the people waiting on the street had no intention of trading. They intended to take, by force if necessary, and they had prepared for resistance. Richard Hoppley drove the Volkswagen Passat that afternoon. He was behind the wheel with Ace in the back seat, navigating the familiar streets of Harborne toward what both men believed was a routine stop. To Richard, it was another ride, another day in a life where his role as a driver placed him close to the shadows of the trade, but not, he might have believed, directly in harm's way. What he couldn't know was that this trip would put him directly in the crosshairs of 4 men who had already decided violence was acceptable. As the Passat pulled up on Underwood Close, Muhammad Karim made his move. Just 24 years old, carrying the knife that Khan had provided or approved, he slid into the front passenger seat and brandished the blade. His demands were clear. Hand over the drugs, hand over the cash, do it quickly and without resistance. The robbery was underway, but chaos followed almost immediately. Richard, sitting just feet away in the driver's seat, tried to intervene. He grabbed at Karim, preventing him from slipping out of the car with the stolen goods, a split-second decision driven by instinct or loyalty, or perhaps simple panic. In that instant, the threat of robbery escalated into violence. With the blade already drawn, Karim lashed out. A single strike, delivered with severe force, drove into Richard's chest. It cut through the 5th rib and penetrated the heart in one motion, a wound so catastrophic that survival would have required immediate surgical intervention, the kind available only in an operating theatre, not on a residential street. Outside the car, the other men moved in. Stallard lunged at the vehicle, reaching for the keys in the ignition, trying to stop it from moving and trapping the occupants inside. Haley's came up alongside and smashed the driver's window, shattering glass across the seat and Richard's body, adding confusion and terror to an already desperate scene. For a few moments, the vehicle became the center of a violent struggle. A dealer pinned in the back seat, his driver wounded and bleeding, and 3 attackers surrounding them, shouting and grabbing and striking. What had begun as a planned robbery, conceived and coordinated over days or perhaps weeks, had in seconds turned into something darker and irreversible. The men had crossed a line that no amount of planning could uncross. The attack lasted only moments, but the damage was already done. Somehow, despite the catastrophic wound and the blood filling his chest cavity, Richard managed to keep the car moving. He pressed the accelerator, dragging Stallard away from the vehicle as it lurched forward, an act of either defiance or desperation, or simply the body's reflex to flee danger. Karim fled the scene on foot, as did Haley's. Khan, who had held his own knife during the attack but never stepped in, stood apart for a moment before disappearing as well. In seconds, the 4 men scattered, each taking a different route away from Underwood Close, leaving behind broken glass, blood, and a man dying at the wheel. The Passat traveled a short distance, swerving across the narrow residential roads as Richard tried to maintain control. But the injury was too severe, the blood loss too rapid, his grip weakening with every passing second. Around half a mile from the ambush, on Mitchley Avenue in Harborne, the car left the road and struck a parked Mercedes with enough force to deploy the airbags and crumple the front end. Passers-by and residents were the first to notice. They came running from nearby houses, some dialing 999 before they even reached the car, their voices urgent and shaking as they tried to describe what they were seeing. Emergency services arrived within minutes. Paramedics worked desperately to revive him, applying pressure to the wound, attempting resuscitation, doing everything their training demanded. But the wound was fatal. The single strike had been delivered with such force that his 5th rib had been severed, and the blade had penetrated deep into the cardiac muscle. Nothing could be done. He was declared dead at the scene, his body still slumped in the driver's seat, surrounded by shattered glass and the smell of blood and engine oil. Police cordoned off the area quickly, stringing blue and white tape across Mitchley Avenue and the surrounding streets. The blood on Richard's clothes, the broken window, the accounts of witnesses who had seen the car swerve and crash, all pointed to a violent struggle that hadn't ended with the collision, but had begun somewhere else, somewhere close by. The crash on Mitchley Avenue left little doubt about what had happened, but it raised immediate questions about who had caused it and why. Within hours, detectives from West Midlands Police's homicide team began piecing together the attack, working backward from the crash site to identify where the violence had originated. They started with CCTV. Cameras across Harborne were checked, their footage downloaded and reviewed frame by frame, tracing the movements of Richard's Volkswagen Passat in the hours leading up to the crash. The footage placed the vehicle on Underwood Close, the spot where the ambush had unfolded, arriving just before 3 o'clock in the afternoon and leaving in a chaotic rush moments later. From there, Investigators turned to phone records, the digital breadcrumbs that modern policing relies upon more than almost any other tool. Cell site data mapped the locations of key suspects, placing them in the Harborne area at the time of the attack, their phones pinging off towers that could narrow their positions to within a few hundred meters. Analysis of calls and messages added another layer, showing clear contact between those later identified as part of the group, conversations that suggested coordination and planning rather than spontaneous violence. CCTV also played a role after the stabbing, with some cameras capturing members of the gang as they fled Underwood Close, their movements hurried and erratic, faces turned away from the lenses, but body language unmistakable. These images, combined with the phone data, helped detectives confirm who had been involved and begin to establish the hierarchy of the group. Witness accounts supported the timeline. Residents who had been at home on Underwood Close that afternoon described seeing a car pull up, hearing raised voices and then watching as men scattered in different directions. Some had seen the broken window, others had noticed the blood on the pavement, and a few had even glimpsed the knife, though none had been close enough to intervene or identify the attacker with certainty. Piece by piece, the evidence revealed not a spontaneous street fight, but a planned robbery involving at least 4 men acting together with assigned roles and a clear objective. The first breakthrough came quickly. Within a few days, 2 men were arrested. Nicholas Stallard and Paul Hales had both been identified as part of the group that had confronted the Volkswagen Passat, their involvement confirmed by CCTV footage and witness statements that placed them at the scene. Both were known to police, their names already in the system for previous offenses, and both had connections to the local drug trade that made their presence at a robbery unsurprising. But the other 2 men, the ones who posed the greatest threat and bore the greatest responsibility, had vanished. Muhammad Karim, the man identified as the one who had delivered the fatal stab wound, fled to Pakistan within days of the attack. Ayub Khan, later described in court as the organizer of the plan, also disappeared overseas, believed to have traveled to Pakistan as well. Their sudden absence confirmed to police that the attack had been more than a random assault or a dispute that had gotten out of hand. It was a carefully conceived robbery that had spiraled into murder, and the men responsible had planned their escape as thoroughly as they had planned the crime. For months, investigators worked quietly, building the case against Stallard and Hales while simultaneously pursuing leads that might bring Khan and Karim back to the UK. Interpol was notified, extradition requests were prepared, and diplomatic channels were engaged, the slow and often frustrating process of international law enforcement cooperation. In the meantime, forensic teams continued their work analyzing the knife wounds, the blood spatter patterns, the DNA recovered from the car, and the street, every detail that might strengthen the prosecution's case or reveal new information about the attack. The evidence against Stallard and Hales was strong, but without Khan and Karim, the full story of what had happened on Underwood Close could not be told in court. The case remained open, unresolved, a source of frustration for detectives and grief for Richard's family, who waited for justice and closure that seemed to recede further with each passing month. Then, in 2023, the situation changed. Muhammad Karim was located in Pakistan and, after negotiations between British and Pakistani authorities, was extradited back to the UK to face charges. The process had taken months involving lawyers, diplomats, and law enforcement officials on both sides, but it represented a significant victory for the investigation. Ayub Khan, however, remained abroad, his location known but his return uncertain, a reminder that even in an age of global surveillance and international cooperation, determined fugitives can still evade justice for years. With Karim back in custody, the case moved forward. In March 2024, all 4 men faced trial at Birmingham Crown Court. The prosecution presented the evidence gathered over 18 months, the CCTV footage, the phone records, the witness statements, the forensic analysis, and the accounts of the attack from multiple perspectives. The jury heard how the robbery had been planned, how Richard had tried to intervene, and how Karim had struck the fatal blow. They heard about the fake £20 note that had started the conflict, the roles each man had played, and the chaos that had followed when the plan went wrong. Nicholas Stallard, aged 45, was found guilty of manslaughter. The jury accepted that while he had been part of the robbery, he had not wielded the knife or intended for Richard to die. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Paul Hales, 63 years old, was convicted of the same charge and received 9 years, his age and lesser role reflected in the slightly reduced sentence. Mohammed Karim, 24, was found guilty of murder. The jury concluded that he had struck Richard with the knife, delivering the blow that had killed him, and that he had done so with the intent to cause serious harm. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 23 years before he could be considered for parole. Ayub Khan, tried in absentia because he remained overseas, was also convicted of murder. The jury accepted the prosecution's argument that as the organizer of the robbery, he bore responsibility for the violence that had followed, even though he had not personally stabbed Richard. He was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 26 years, a sentence he would serve if and when he was ever returned to the UK. The convictions brought a measure of closure, but they could not restore what had been taken. Richard Hoppley's family spoke outside the court, describing him as a man who had struggled, but who had never deserved to die on a Birmingham street because of someone else's greed and violence. His death, they said, was a reminder of how quickly disputes in the drug trade could turn fatal, and how the people caught in the middle, the drivers and runners and users, were often the ones who paid the highest price. On Wednesday, the 31st of January 2024, Wallace Webb, known to those close to him as Wally, opened the door of his flat in Errington to someone he believed he could trust. It was just before midnight, the kind of hour when few visitors arrive with good intentions, but Wallace let the person in without hesitation. What happened next behind that closed door would not be discovered for nearly a week. When the silence was finally broken, the scene inside told a story of violence so brutal that even experienced investigators struggled to process what they found. Wallace was 60 years old, a man who had spent much of his life on the margins of society, navigating poverty, addiction, and the informal economies that exist in neighborhoods where conventional employment is scarce and survival often depends on networks of mutual dependence and exploitation. He lived alone in a small flat in Errington, a southeast London neighborhood characterized by housing estates, corner shops, and streets where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. To some, Wallace was a familiar face, someone who could be seen walking to the shops or sitting on a bench near the estate. To others, he was a figure best avoided, a man with connections to the drug trade and a past that included both victimhood and complicity in the cycles of crime that defined the area. On that Wednesday night, Wallace welcomed someone into his home. Investigators would later determine that this person was not a stranger but someone Wallace knew, perhaps even trusted to some degree, though the exact nature of their relationship remains unclear. What is known is that the visitor did not come alone and did not come with peaceful intentions. Behind the closed door of Wallace's flat, a confrontation took place. The details of what was said, what demands were made, or what disputes were settled remain mostly unknown. What is clear is that the confrontation turned violent, and Wallace, outnumbered and outmatched, had no means of escape. He was stabbed multiple times, the wounds inflicted with a level of force and repetition that suggested not just an intent to harm, but an intent to ensure death. The attack was sustained, methodical in its brutality, and when it was over, Wallace lay dead in his own home, his body left where it had fallen. For nearly 6 days, no one came looking. His phone went unanswered, his flat remained silent, and the routine rhythms of the neighborhood continued around him. It was not unusual for Wallace to go unseen for a few days, his lifestyle and social circle not the kind that demanded daily contact or regular check-ins. But as the days stretched on, someone, perhaps a neighbor or a friend, began to worry. On the 6th of February 2024, a concerned party contacted the police, reporting that they had not seen or heard from Wallace in nearly a week and feared something might be wrong. Officers attended the flat in Errington and, receiving no response to their knocking, forced entry. What they found inside confirmed the worst fears and set in motion one of the most complex murder investigations the Metropolitan Police would undertake that year. Wallace Webb's body was found in the main room of the flat, surrounded by signs of the struggle that had taken place. Blood had pooled on the floor and spattered across nearby surfaces, the forensic signature of multiple stab wounds delivered in rapid succession. The flat itself bore evidence of a search or a confrontation. Items disturbed, furniture moved, the kind of disorder that suggested the attack had been chaotic and violent rather than quick and clinical. Paramedics, called to the scene as a matter of protocol, confirmed what was already obvious. Wallace had been dead for days, his body in the early stages of decomposition in the unheated flat. The scene was immediately secured, blue and white police tape stretched across the entrance, and a forensic team was called in to begin the painstaking process of documenting every detail. Detectives from the Metropolitan Police's Specialist Crime Command took charge of the investigation. They began with the scene itself, photographing the body, the blood patterns, the disturbed items, and the points of entry and exit. Forensic officers collected samples from every surface, swabbing for DNA, lifting fingerprints, and bagging items that might later prove relevant in court. The pathologist who examined Wallace's body confirmed that he had been stabbed multiple times, the wounds concentrated in the torso and consistent with a sustained attack rather than a single defensive strike. The time of death was estimated to be sometime in the late hours of January 31st or the very early morning of February 1st, meaning Wallace had lain undiscovered for nearly 6 days, a delay that complicated the investigation by allowing potential evidence to degrade and witnesses' memories to fade. But while the physical evidence was crucial, it was the digital trail that would prove most valuable. Detectives pulled phone records for Wallace's mobile, identifying the numbers that had been in contact with him in the hours and days before his death. They cross-referenced these numbers with known associates, building a map of Wallace's social network and identifying individuals who might have had reason to visit him that night. Cell site data placed several of these individuals in the Errington area at the time of the murder, their phones pinging off the same towers that had registered Wallace's phone, a digital fingerprint that was harder to erase than any physical trace. CCTV footage from nearby streets and estates was collected and reviewed, hours of grainy footage scrutinized for glimpses of people arriving at or leaving the building where Wallace lived. Slowly, names began to emerge, individuals who had been seen in the area, whose phones had been active nearby, and who had known connections to Wallace through the drug trade or other criminal activity. The investigation was methodical and deliberate, the kind of work that relies on patience and persistence rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Detectives conducted interviews with neighbors, friends, and associates, many of whom were reluctant to speak, their silence born of fear or loyalty or a deep mistrust of law enforcement. Some provided fragments of information, a name here, a sighting there, pieces that on their own seemed insignificant, but that together began to form a coherent picture. Others refused to cooperate entirely, their doors closed and their phones unanswered, a reminder that in neighborhoods like Errington, talking to the police can carry consequences that extend far beyond the courtroom. Despite these obstacles, the investigation moved forward. Forensic results began to come back, DNA profiles extracted from the scene and compared against the national database. Fingerprints lifted from Wallace's flat matched individuals who were already known to police, their criminal records providing additional context and motive. Phone data continued to be analyzed, revealing patterns of communication that suggested planning and coordination rather than a spontaneous visit gone wrong. And as the evidence accumulated, a clearer picture emerged of what had happened that night and who had been responsible. By late spring 2024, the Metropolitan Police had identified several individuals they believed were involved in Wallace Webb's murder. Arrests were made in coordinated operations across southeast London, each suspect taken into custody and questioned at length. Some denied any involvement, others provided partial accounts or shifted blame to their co-defendants, and a few remained silent, exercising their right to legal representation without making any statements. The evidence, however, was mounting. DNA from the scene matched several of the suspects, placing them inside Wallace's flat at the time of the murder or shortly thereafter. Phone records showed communication between the suspects in the hours before and after the killing, messages that could be interpreted as planning or as an attempt to establish alibis. Witness statements, though fragmented and sometimes contradictory, placed the suspects in the area and described vehicles or individuals that matched their descriptions. Piece by piece, the case was built, not on a single damning piece of evidence, but on the cumulative weight of dozens of smaller details that together told a story of premeditated violence. The trial began in late 2024 at the Central Criminal Court, commonly known as the Old Bailey, one of the most famous courtrooms in the world and the venue for many of Britain's most serious criminal cases. The prosecution presented the evidence gathered over months of investigation, the forensic analysis, the phone records, the CCTV footage, and the witness statements. They argued that Wallace Webb had been murdered by a group of individuals who had entered his flat with the intent to rob or assault him, and that the attack had been carried out with such violence that death had been the inevitable result. The defense, representing multiple defendants, challenged the reliability of the forensic evidence, questioned the credibility of witnesses, and argued that while some of their clients may have been present at the scene, their involvement had been minimal or coerced. The jury heard testimony from forensic experts who explained how DNA transfer works, how blood spatter patterns can reveal the dynamics of an attack, and how cell site data can place individuals within specific geographic areas at specific times. They heard from neighbors who described seeing unfamiliar faces in the building that night, from friends who recounted Wallace's last known movements, and from police officers who described the scene they had discovered on February 6th. The trial lasted several weeks, the evidence presented in painstaking detail, the arguments made and rebutted in the formal language of British criminal law. In the end, the jury returned guilty verdicts for several of the defendants. The exact charges and sentences varied depending on each individual's role in the attack, the evidence against them, and their prior criminal history. But the message was clear. Those responsible for Wallace Webb's death would be held accountable. The convictions were a victory for the Metropolitan Police and for Wallace's family, who had waited months for justice. Outside the court, detectives spoke to the press, describing the investigation as one of the most challenging they had worked on, not because of a lack of evidence, but because of the complexity of the relationships between the suspects and the difficulty of persuading witnesses to come forward. They praised the forensic team, the analysts who had worked through thousands of hours of CCTV and phone data, and the community members who had eventually found the courage to speak. Wallace Webb's death, they said, was a tragedy that might have been prevented if someone had intervened earlier, if the cycles of debt and violence that defined parts of southeast London could be broken, if the systems meant to protect vulnerable people had been more effective. But those are broader questions, the kind that extend beyond any single investigation or conviction, and that remain unanswered even as the case was closed. If we consider the case of Kai McKinley, we see another example of how violence in the UK's criminal underworld often follows predictable patterns, disputes over territory, debts, or perceived slights escalating into coordinated attacks involving multiple participants. Kai McKinley was 24 years old, a young man navigating a world where survival often meant making choices between bad options and worse ones. On the night of May 9, 2023, he was driving through southeast London in a white Mini Countryman, unaware that he was being followed by a convoy of vehicles whose occupants had marked him for violence. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. Two cars boxed the Mini into a trap on Pembroke Road in Southwark, ramming it off the road and bringing it to a sudden, violent stop. Masked figures emerged, armed with a shotgun and other weapons, and opened fire at close range. The shotgun blast struck Kai as he sat trapped in the driver's seat, the pellets tearing through flesh and bone with devastating effect. Within moments, it was over. The attackers fled, their vehicles disappearing into the maze of southeast London streets, and Kai was left dying at the roadside, his Mini crumpled and his body shattered. Paramedics arrived quickly, summoned by witnesses who had heard the gunfire and seen the crash, but despite their efforts, Kai was pronounced dead at the scene at 9:31 p.m., less than an hour after the attack. The murder of Kai McKinley sent shockwaves through his community and triggered one of the Metropolitan Police's most intensive investigations of the year. Detectives arriving at the scene found not just a victim, but a crime scene that told a story of careful planning and ruthless execution. The white Mini stood crumpled at an angle, airbags hanging loose, Glass shattered across the road. Beside it, forensic officers recovered spent shotgun cartridge fragments, each one logged as evidence and later analyzed to determine the type of weapon used and potentially link it to other crimes. Just meters away, the wrecked Land Rover Freelander that had been used to ram the Mini stood abandoned, its engine crushed from the force of the deliberate collision. Inside the Freelander, investigators found traces that tied it back to known associates of the men who had carried out the ambush, fingerprints, DNA, and items consistent with the violence of the attack, including fragments of shotgun cartridges that matched those found on the road, and even bladed weapons, including a machete, that had been carried as part of the group's arsenal. Every item was bagged, catalogued, and added to the growing case file, each one a piece of the puzzle that would eventually lead to convictions. Beyond physical evidence, detectives began speaking to residents who had rushed to their windows or doors when they heard the crash and the gunfire. The consistency of their accounts reinforced the picture of a coordinated ambush, not a random act of violence, but a planned execution carried out by multiple individuals working together. At the same time, officers turned to the digital trail. Mobile phone data and cell tower tracking began to highlight numbers associated with some of the suspects shown to be in the area at the time of the shooting. Their movements before and after the attack, plotted on maps that revealed the convoy's route and the suspects' attempts to flee. Later, detectives cross-referencing this data with CCTV footage and witness statements proved vital in narrowing down the list of possible names and building a timeline that would stand up in court. Piece by piece, the evidence started to close in on the men responsible, but the clearest breakthrough didn't come from fingerprints, cartridges, or even phone records. It came from something harder to outrun: the unblinking eye of CCTV cameras positioned across southeast London's streets and estates. Working through hours of footage, investigators first plotted the Mini Countryman's journey that night. They were able to track the white car as it moved through local streets, showing its approach to Pembroke Road before the fatal collision. More importantly, at some points, the same cameras picked up the convoy of attackers as well, revealing that the vehicles had been deliberately following Kai, their movements synchronized and purposeful. Frame by frame, detectives mapped how the two vehicles had coordinated, boxing the Mini into a trap from which there was no escape. After the shooting, the lenses told another story. Later sequences traced one of the attack vehicles, a Peugeot, to a familiar location: the garage belonging to Bradley Reeve, a 34-year-old man already known to police. The grainy images showed men disappearing inside, their outlines, clothing, and movements matching descriptions from eyewitnesses as well as footage from the scene of the attack. When cross-referenced with phone data, the evidence lined up. Every camera angle, every signal ping, every trace inside the abandoned Land Rover pointing toward the same group of individuals. One piece of evidence on its own might have raised questions or been dismissed as circumstantial. Together, they drew a map that led investigators directly to the men responsible. The masked figures who had stepped out to carry out the violence were no longer faceless. Piece by piece, their identities began to emerge from the shadows. For Kai's mother, Lena McKinley, the murder of her 24-year-old son was more than a headline or a case number. In court, she described him in words that carried the weight of a life interrupted. "Kai was my youngest child and only son. My boy Kai was 24 years old when he went out one day and didn't come home." Her testimony was quiet but devastating, a mother's grief given voice in a courtroom filled with lawyers, defendants, and journalists. After his death, Lena found a half-written rap in his belongings, verses he had never finished, lines that spoke of dreams and struggles and a future he would never see. She spoke about how it broke her to see those lines cut short, as though his voice had been silenced mid-sentence, his story left incomplete. The loss rippled beyond the McKinley family. Online, friends and community members shared tributes, calling him an angel and a brother in soul. Some recalled his humility, others his energy, and many simply expressed disbelief that someone so young and vibrant had been taken so suddenly and so violently. In the days that followed, flowers, candles, and handwritten notes appeared along Pembroke Road, a makeshift shrine marking the spot where his life had ended. Strangers and loved ones alike stopped to lay bouquets, a quiet gesture of respect and sorrow for a young man who had become a symbol of loss in a community already too familiar with grief. By early spring 2024, the investigation had sharpened to a point. The Metropolitan Police launched a series of raids across southeast London, determined to bring in all 7 men linked to the ambush. The first to fall was Bradley Reeve, tracked through the garage footage and forensic evidence that tied him directly to the crime. DNA inside the Land Rover Freelander, combined with CCTV showing the vehicle at his property, left little room for doubt. Police picked him up at his home in Eltham, executing the arrest with precision to avoid any chance of flight. Enrio Sparu and Anthony Walder, both 21 years old, were traced through DNA evidence recovered from the Land Rover and digital evidence showing their phones in the area at the time of the attack. They were arrested in coordinated operations not long after Reeve, each taken into custody without resistance. Kai Oibudu, 25, was identified through his connection to the Freelander that had delivered the ramming blow, CCTV and phone data, placing him in the vehicle at the time of the attack. He was detained following surveillance in his own neighborhood, officers moving quickly to prevent him from destroying evidence or leaving the area. For the younger men, Charles Selby Ganga, Connor Brooks, and Charlie Brabin, it was the web of CCTV and phone data that closed around them. Each was placed at the scene, their movements syncing with the groups, their phones communicating with the others in the hours before and after the murder. Brooks and Selby Ganga were arrested in the months that followed, while Brabin was charged later after further evidence confirmed his role in the planning and execution of the attack. Despite extensive searches, the firearms used that night were never recovered, leaving investigators to rely on ballistic fragments, forensic analysis of the wounds, and the other supporting evidence they had gathered. The shotgun that killed Kai McKinley, along with any other weapons the group had carried, had been disposed of, hidden, or destroyed, a frustrating but not uncommon outcome in cases involving firearms. One by one, between March and September 2023, the 7 men were taken off the streets. What had begun as a masked ambush in the dark was now unfolding in the open, each man facing the consequences of his role in a murder that had been captured on camera, recorded in digital signals, and traced through forensic evidence that could not be erased. The case reached the Old Bailey in 2024, where prosecutors presented the evidence gathered over months of investigation. The jury heard about the convoy that had followed Kai's Mini, the deliberate ramming that had trapped him, the shotgun blast that had killed him, and the flight of the attackers afterward. They heard from forensic experts who explained how DNA and fingerprints had been recovered, from digital analysts who traced phone signals and mapped movements, and from eyewitnesses who described the chaos and terror of that night. They saw CCTV footage that showed the attack unfolding in real time, grainy but undeniable images of masked figures emerging from vehicles and approaching the Mini with weapons drawn. The defense argued that some of the defendants had been coerced, that others had played only minor roles, and that the forensic evidence was not as definitive as the prosecution claimed, but the cumulative weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The jury agreed. One by one, the 7 men were convicted, their roles and levels of involvement reflected in the verdicts. Bradley Reeve, aged 34, was found guilty of murder and grievous bodily harm. He was ordered to serve life in prison with a minimum term of 33 years, one of the longest sentences handed down, and a reflection of the court's view that he had been a central figure in the planning and execution of the attack. Alongside him, Enrio Sparu, 21, and Anthony Walder, 21, were also convicted of murder. Each was sentenced to life with a minimum of 29 years before parole could be considered, their youth offering no mitigation in the face of the brutality they had participated in. Kai Oibudu, 25, tied to the Land Rover that had rammed the Mini off the road, was also convicted of murder. He was handed a life sentence with a minimum of 30 years, the judge noting that without his role in stopping the vehicle, the attack could not have been carried out. For the younger defendants, the court accepted that their roles had been secondary but still vital to the ambush. Connor Brooks, 22, was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, the jury concluding that while he had been present and involved, he had not been one of the primary actors. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Charles Selby Ganger, 19, was given 9.5 years for manslaughter, while Charlie Brabin, also 19, was sentenced to 9 years. In total, the 7 men received more than 150 years of prison time, a collective punishment that reflected the severity of their crime and the determination of the justice system to hold them accountable. Outside the Old Bailey, Lena McKinley spoke to the press, her voice steady but her grief palpable. She said that no sentence could bring her son back, that no amount of time behind bars could fill the space he had left in her life. But she also said that she hoped the convictions would send a message that violence of this kind could not go unpunished, that those who thought they could operate with impunity would eventually face justice. Detectives involved in the case echoed her sentiments, describing the investigation as one of the most complex they had worked on, but also one of the most important. They praised the forensic teams, the analysts, the uniformed officers who had secured the scene, and the witnesses who had found the courage to come forward despite the risks. They acknowledged that the work was not over, that firearms remained on the streets of London, that gangs continued to operate, and that young men like Kai McKinley remained vulnerable to the cycles of violence that had claimed his life. But for this case, at least, there was closure. The men responsible were behind bars, the evidence had been presented, and the verdicts had been delivered. The cases of Richard Hoppley, Wallace Webb, and Kai McKinley are distinct in their details, but united by common threads. Each victim was drawn into a world where disputes are settled with violence, where debts and disrespect can escalate into murder, and where the people caught in the middle often have little agency or protection. Each investigation relied on the same tools: CCTV footage, phone data, forensic analysis, and the slow, methodical work of detectives who refused to let the cases go unsolved. Each trial demonstrated the power of evidence, the importance of witnesses, and the ability of the British justice system to hold perpetrators accountable even when they attempt to flee or destroy evidence. But these cases also raise larger questions, questions that extend beyond the courtroom and into the communities where these crimes took place. What drives young men to participate in planned violence? What systems or interventions might prevent disputes from escalating? How can communities break the cycles of debt, addiction, and retribution that make violence seem inevitable? These are not questions with simple answers, and they are not questions that can be resolved by law enforcement alone. They require investment in education, healthcare, social services, and economic opportunities, the kind of long-term, systemic change that is far harder to achieve than any individual conviction. For the families left behind, the convictions brought a measure of justice, but could not restore what had been taken. Richard Hoppley's family continues to mourn a son who struggled, but who had been kind, and who had deserved a chance at recovery and redemption. Wallace Webb's loved ones remember a man who had been failed by systems that should have protected him, a man whose life had been difficult, but who had not deserved to die alone and violently in his own home. Lena McKinley carries the grief of a mother who will never see her son grow older, who will never hear the rest of the rap he had been writing, who will never know what he might have become if he had been given the chance. These are the human costs of crime, the losses that cannot be quantified in sentences or statistics, but that echo through families and communities for years. And as the legal system moves on to the next case, the next investigation, the next trial, these families remain, carrying their grief and their memories and the knowledge that for them, closure is not the same as healing. The legacy of these cases is complex. On one hand, they demonstrate the effectiveness of modern investigative techniques, the ability of forensic science and digital analysis to uncover truths that might once have remained hidden. They show that even when perpetrators flee the country or attempt to cover their tracks, justice can still be pursued and achieved. On the other hand, they reveal the persistence of violence in certain communities, the failure of deterrence, and the reality that for every conviction, there are dozens of young men waiting to take the place of those incarcerated. The drug trade continues, the disputes continue, and the cycle of violence continues, fed by poverty, inequality, and the absence of legitimate opportunities. These are the uncomfortable truths that true crime documentaries often gloss over, the systemic failures that make individual stories of crime and punishment feel both urgent and, in some ways, futile. But understanding these cases, understanding the people involved and the systems that shape their choices, is essential if we are to move beyond simply punishing perpetrators and toward preventing the conditions that create them. That work is harder, slower, and less satisfying than a trial verdict, but it is the work that must be done if we are serious about reducing violence and creating safer communities for everyone.